You're listening to 106.9 Tune FM. My name is Ash Taylor, and I'm here with Dr. Tom Le Breton from the University of New South Wales to discuss the Varroa mites and their impact on native species of both plants and bees. So thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Tom.
No worries, Ash. Thanks for having me on.
So how'd you get started and interested in this subject?
So my background's in plant conservation, and particularly looking at threatened species and extinction risk to native plant species. And when I'd heard about the impact that the Varroa mite was going to have on feral bee populations, which are a major flower visitor and pollinator for a lot of native plant species, I thought it might be worth looking into seeing whether it was going to increase the risk to some of our threatened plant species. And that's what kickstarted this project.
Yeah, so you're a botanist by discipline, is that right?
Yeah, more of a plant ecologist. I'm not very good at telling two plants apart in the field, but I can tell you how a lot of them work.
Yeah, for sure. And so in Australia, we have a large number of native species of both plants and bees. What sort of numbers would we be looking at?
Yeah, so for endemic plant species, we've got 24,000 plant species that only occur in Australia and nowhere else. And for the bees, I think the number's somewhere above 1,700, and they're all across Australia. So
yeah, that is a lot. And they're all very different. They all sort of have, very different habitats and things like that. So do native species of plants have specific native bees or just bees and pollinators in general that prefer those plants or that are more beneficial to them?
Yeah, so there's a mix. There's a lot of species that are generalist pollinated and are happy for anything to come and visit their flowers and carry the pollen wherever it sort of goes next. But then there's a lot of native species that are also very specialised. And at the very far end of the spectrum, you'll get things like orchids, which might only have a single insect species which can pollinate it. But in terms of bees, there's species like, I think, Herbaceae, which are buzz pollinated. So they need species like carpenter bees, which are a native species, to come along and vibrate at a certain frequency to release the pollen and that sort of thing. So they aren't as effectively pollinated by things like European honeybees because they don't have the right sort of approach, I guess.
Yeah, okay. So I guess that sort of takes me to my next question about European honeybees. So what makes them feral?
Right, yeah.
So everywhere.
So yeah, the difference between feral honeybees and your normal European honeybee is basically just whether they're from a managed hive or not. And you get feral honeybee hives where a queen has escaped or left a managed hive and found, say, a tree hollow or the side of your house or a log or somewhere to set up a new nest. And then they'll develop a colony around that and spread from there. So I think Australia has had European honeybees since about 1820, and they've spread quite a long way across the country from one end to the other. And we also have the highest density of feral honeybee hives of anywhere in the world.
Yeah, so how is that impacting native plants?
Well, so one of the things we realised while we were doing this research was that we don't actually have a great idea. There hasn't been a ton of research into the impact of European honeybees on native plant pollination. And part of the problem is that they've been here so long, it's difficult to have a sort of control where there's no European honeybees. You can do that experimentally, but it's laborious and there hasn't been enough investment in that sort of research of native species. There's been some in agricultural species, but not so much in native species. So we don't have a great idea, but there's our research found from a literature review that there's mixed effects. Some species benefit and some species are negatively impacted.
So why do you think it is that it is almost it's sort of I'd say an emerging research area now, but there is no previous data on it?
Well, it's not so much that it's emergent. There's like a long history of research on it. It's just it's struggled to get funding in comparison to other sort of more pressing maybe or more flashy ecological topics. There's a lot of people that have done a lot of really good work on it, but it only covers, I think, something like 3.2% of the Australian flora. So there's still a lot of unknowns, and yeah, it's just for something that's a fundamental ecological process, it's not something we've had the money or time to look at closely enough.
Yeah, which I honestly, that is a massive shame, because our native species are some of the most beautiful plants and most interesting plants out there, with their evolutionary adaptations and things like that. They don't look like any other plant in the world when you look at things like bottle brush or wattles or things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And because of that, so they have a lot of the unique adaptations. So it's not easy to directly transfer the research that has been done in other countries to the Australian context. We really need to look at the specifics of Australian species. Yeah.
Your recent paper, you're looking at the impacts of Varroa Mite on feral honeybee populations. And obviously, this is a massive biosecurity risk. But what did you kind of find when looking at its impacts? Because it was on native populations, right?
Yeah, so we're looking at the impact of Varroa Mite on plant species essentially via their impact on honeybees. So what has happened in other countries when Varroa Mites arrived is within the first sort of 5 to 10 years, 95% of the feral honeybee hives collapse and the populations die off. So you're only left with the commercial hives. And because there's such a high density of feral honeybees in Australia, that's going to amount to quite a large proportion of potential pollinators and flower visitors to native species. And so, yeah, that's where our interest came in. And
so, yeah, you were looking at the ways in which this affects the native species of plants and bees. So, and before you were talking about how there are differences in how the honeybee populations, these European honeybees, some of them have positive impacts on native plants and some of them have negative impacts. Would you say that, I guess it's preliminary data kind of right now because we don't have much there. These are an invasive species. If the population were to decline, would you guess that would be sort of a net positive?
It's difficult to say. Like they're always going to be in the landscape, and they should be. They're a vital part of agriculture, and beekeeping and the honey industry is very important, obviously, as well. So they're always going to be there, and a lot of those industries also, like the honey industry, relies a lot on things like eucalyptus and stuff. So and they're performing important ecological services. At the moment, it doesn't look like there's not really strong evidence at the moment to say that they are having an absolutely negative impact in the environment. Plus, they've been here so long, a lot of that's probably been absorbed and species have sort of adapted to it to a certain extent. But I think the loss of feral hives will relieve some of the pressures that are there just through the sheer numbers of honeybees that there are. And where there are negative impacts, it will roll them back. The places where it's likely to have, where it's likely to be a negative thing for native species is where you have things like species with isolated populations, so like paddock trees or very small isolated fragments in like urban remnants. Honeybees are good for pollinating those because they travel further than a lot of our native insect pollinators do. And so they'll keep gene flow and pollen transfer happening between more distantly separated populations. So those sort of things are probably going to suffer. But a lot of other things will probably do better. So I don't know about net positive or net negative, but I don't think the loss of feral honeybees isn't going to be a bad thing altogether.
Yes.
There's just things to keep an eye out for.
So there's not going to be an earth-shattering post-apocalyptic scenario where all the bees are gone at this stage.
No, not at this stage. And hopefully as well, most of the native pollinators can fill any of the shortfall there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Because you said to me your work is largely on native plant conservation.
Mhm.
How did that lead to the looking at the bees specifically?
Yeah, so it was literally just the idea that pollination is such a crucial part of the life cycle of all plant species, well, most plant species, and because European honeybees are so numerically dominant, like the numbers of European honeybees recorded as just dwarfs a lot of other species at some sites and for some species, plant species that they visit. There's a risk that losing those numbers could reduce pollination and reduce the ability of those plants to set seeds. And so, because there's all these other threats also going on in the landscape, like fragmentation, frequent fires, flooding, land clearing, that making it harder for those species to persist if their ability to recruit and produce new seedlings also declines because of the loss of the bees. That's going to make their recovery much more difficult.
Yeah,
So that was the sort of source of concern for us.
because it's a very interesting study. It jumped out to me when I was reading through our articles because I just watched a YouTube video from this guy called the Backyard Naturalist.
Oh, nice.
I don't know if you've heard of him, but he did a short video on specifically Australian native bee species because he's Australian himself. And, in it, he was talking about the Varroa mite and, again, that decline of feral European honeybee population and how that might benefit or impact our native bee species. And then, your study jumped out to me and went, oh, this is not a topic that I think many people have considered, at least that I've seen. Is it something that you've seen people talk about a lot in your sort of field?
It wasn't at the time. We I came up with the idea for the project about a year and a bit ago. And at that point, I hadn't heard anybody discuss the sort of impacts for native species. Once I started looking into it, a lot of the sort of native bee researchers and native pollinator researchers had already sort of started to consider it, and some broader sort of pieces on the sort of national impacts of the Varroa mite had mentioned that there would be environmental impacts as well. But in terms of plants, nobody had really raised it yet. But certainly the people in the bee research community, which is, I think, quite small, had been raising the alarm bells, or not alarm bells, but bringing it up as a topic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What other sort of threats are our native plants? You've mentioned the fires, you mentioned clearing. You also mentioned fragmentation, which is not a term that I'm familiar with. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So fragmentation is sort of a result of land clearing and urbanization, where you get, you'll clear tracts of land for agriculture, or you'll clear it for housing, and there'll be little patches of bush left in between. And so native species will persist in those patches, and they can persist for quite a long time, and some can even happily sort of tick over and keep reproducing healthily within those small patches. But other species will struggle if they can't transfer pollen between populations. They'll become genetically isolated and might not be able to produce offspring. And it also, just when things are in smaller fragments, the risk of a single event taking that population out, something like a really severe fire that kills all the plants, or a storm or another clearing event taking all those plants out, increases. And so, it creates a whole range of complications for species persistence.
Yeah, and it sadly seems like something we're starting to see a lot more of, with
Yeah,
everything that's going on.
yeah. Australia's had a long history of fragmentation due to all the land clearing that's gone on, and parts of Australia where land clearing has accelerated in the last few years, like Queensland, are seeing more of it. And yeah, just as urban population continues to grow, it's always going to grow there as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that sort of we got started speaking a little bit more about the Varroa Mite. That is sort of the big ticket item. I think a lot of people are rightfully freaking out about that. Its biosecurity risk, its potential impacts on the horticulture and agriculture of Australia, and people's livelihoods. But what you're saying here and what you're pointing out that I hope our listeners think about a little bit is that there are all these knock-on effects that a lot of people aren't considering, about this loss of pollinators. So, if the worst case were to happen and we do lose those pollinators, well, I suppose you've already talked about that a little bit. The native species will kind of hopefully fill that niche. But are there introduced plants that rely on specifically the European honeybee where, our native species won't be able to fill that niche?
Yeah, so that's something that we considered in the paper, and I'm not sure how much evidence there is for it, but a lot of weed species, there's a sort of theory that because they come from the same range as honeybees in Europe, so things like, I can't think of any species off the top of my head, but...
Heather, maybe?
Yeah, heather would be one. They're co-evolved with the European honeybee, so they're likely to be more readily pollinated by it, and they might struggle to be pollinated as well by native species. So that could be another potential benefit where the loss of feral honeybees slows down the recruitment and population growth of weeds in some areas. But I'm not sure how much evidence there is for that.
Yeah, of course. So just a theory at the moment, but an interesting and almost a positive one, I would say. The lack of introduced weed species means that our native species can flourish a little bit more.
Yeah. Hopefully, one less challenge for them.
Yeah, definitely. You do, we're talking so much about plant conservation, which hopefully people out there who are into gardening, into plants, maybe they're studying botany themselves. What can people do at home to help support our native plants?
So planting native plants is always a good one. A lot of threatened species are in cultivation as one of the sort of strategies to try and conserve them. It's not always going to help the populations in the wild, but it means that there's always reserve populations and that they're still fulfilling some of their ecological function in the broader landscape. And that also encourages native pollinators as well. So having native flowers means that native pollinators have something to feed on and they can breed and flourish, hopefully. So that's always a really positive one. Anything, not planting things that are weeds, that's a big one. I think there's still a lot of things you can get from Bunnings and places like that are quite weedy. So avoiding doing things like that, particularly if you're near urban remnants or like near bushland where it might escape and get away into that.
Oh yeah, here in Armidale we have a big blackberry problem.
Yeah, blackberries just everywhere once you get west of the Blue Mountains sort of thing. Like that's a real rife one. That sort of thing. And they're often things that people don't really realise are weedy or are quite attractive garden plants. So being aware of that sort of thing. One of the things we're launching off the back of this project is a citizen science project on the iNaturalist platform.
Oh, fantastic.
Where people can sign up and upload photos of pollinators, whether they're honeybees or native pollinators, on different native plant species. And so the goal of that is for us to get baseline data about flower visitation rates of different pollinators. And then once Varroa reaches those areas, we'll hopefully keep it going, and then we can compare how that's changed before and after the arrival of Varroa and the loss of the feral honeybees.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things we're hoping to do there as well.
That's fantastic. I've spoken to Tanya Laddie about the Christmas beetle count on iNaturalist and a few other different people who are using iNaturalist as a platform for these citizen science projects. So that's fantastic news to hear. When is that project hopefully going to drop?
It's live now, so I can share the link with you.
Yeah.
interview.
Yeah, please do. And does the project have a name for any of our listeners who want to
Yeah,
go on
yeah.
Google and
If
get
anybody
involved?
wants to find it, it's called the Honeybee Visitation and Native Plant Pollination Australia project, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So how long are you going to keep it going? Indefinitely or?
It'll run indefinitely, hopefully, and people can just keep adding to it, and the data will always be there for anyone, even if me or my collaborators have to move on to other stuff, whatever it is, and the data will always be there for people to come back to and use. And that's one of the good things about iNaturalist is it's a permanent repository for all those sorts of observations.
Yeah, for sure. Is it easy to access the data if you're a researcher?
Yeah, it is quite easy. I mean, the public can access it just as readily. I think there's a few back-end things that we might be able to get access to through the iNaturalist sort of platform, but it's all pretty open. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really exciting. Have you had many reports at the moment or still waiting?
I think we've got like 16 so far.
Okay. All good. Well,
you
you'll have to let me know if there's a spike after this one goes live.
Yeah, I'll keep you posted.
So yeah, for anyone interested in getting involved, please do. I don't want to keep you all afternoon, but citizen science is one of our big favorite topics here at Tune FM, and particularly as we have access to a wide range of students, many of them interested in things like that. I'm sure a number of them will be keen to get involved.
Yeah, it's a great thing.
I guess to just wrap up, do you have a favorite native plant species in Australia?
Favorite native plant species? I don't know. They're hard to pick. I did my honours on a species called Pomaderus bedala, which is the sort of thing you walk past 1,000 times until you're told to look for it, and then once you sort of find it, it's quite a pretty attractive plant with nice little flowers and grows in these beautiful little gullies in down on the south coast. So that's a favourite one.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. And is there anything that, you think is important, anything in your research that you'd like to share that I've missed or haven't touched on?
I think probably the only thing that we haven't really touched on is just sort of the idea that knowing that Varroa Mite is here and that it's going to eventually take out about 95% of the feral population of honeybees, it's a really rare opportunity to sort of have something arrive. A threat sort of arrive and know the direct impact that it's going to have, and be able to prepare for that in terms of research and experimental design and conservation as well. And so I think the window we have now, it's already spreading quite quickly across New South Wales, but the other states, it'll hopefully be slower due to biosecurity protocols. But it gives us a window to prepare for that. And I don't think it'd be a shame if we let it slip by.
Yeah, know your enemy, as it were.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope that our listeners out there, keen to get involved in a citizen science project, you've got another one lined up, particularly if you already have the iNaturalist app. And for anyone else out there listening, you've learned a little bit more about conservation and a oddly potential positive impact of the Varroa Mite in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks, heaps. It's been great talking to you.
No worries. You're listening to 106.9 Tune FM, the home of UNE's student-powered radio.